The other day, I was at church and I saw somebody waving at me. They were just waving at me. Has that ever happened to you? You see somebody, they're waving? And I didn't know if I knew them because I've met a lot of people. I keep saying, like, I've got 2,000 new best friends, right? So, like, I don't know everybody's name yet. So I started waving back. I was like, hello. You look familiar, I'll wave back. But they kept waving. So I was waving even harder. I was like, hey, no, I'm right here. And then I realized something was wrong. And so I turned around, and there was somebody waving behind me. I was like in a crossfire of waves. I had no idea that I had completely missed it. Has anybody else in this room done that? Like, has anybody else felt me in that? Okay, you've been there too. It's like the most awkward thing ever. You hope that nobody saw you. You kind of put your hand down and kind of slink away. And a lot of us feel that kind of miscommunication sometimes with God. We wonder, is God speaking to me? Is he trying to get my attention, or is he simply speaking to somebody else? Maybe somebody who's a little bit more spiritual than me, or somebody who's got a little bit better access to God, or maybe to the pastor, but surely he's not waving at me. And so we kind of slink away and try to act like nobody saw us. But the Bible tells us that God is constantly talking. In Job chapter 33, verse 14, it says this: "For God speaks time and time again, but a person may not notice it." So what the Bible tells us is that God is constantly speaking. He's constantly speaking to us and calling us into more. And as a people of God, it's my deepest desire that we would be people who listen and respond, that we would be quick to hear God's voice and follow him. And so today, as we continue our study of the book of Jonah, we're going to find some tangible ways to hear God's voice and respond, because sometimes following God can be very disorienting, right? We can feel like, man, I don't know if I'm getting the right signals here. I don't know if I'm picking up what he's laying down. I'm not sure what he's trying to do. And so today I hope to have a lot of clarity in your mind as you walk away and hear the word of the Lord. So Jonah chapter 1, we're going to start in verse 4. We're going to read a little bit, and then we'll unpack it and then apply it. So it says this: "But the Lord threw a great wind onto the sea, and such a great storm arose on the sea that the ship threatened to break apart. The sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his God. They threw the ship's cargo into the sea to lighten the load. Meanwhile, Jonah had gone down to the lowest part of the vessel and had stretched out and fallen into a deep sleep. The captain approached him and said, 'What are you doing? Sound asleep? Get up. Call to your God. Maybe this God will consider us and we won't perish.' 'Come on,' the sailors said to each other, 'let's cast lots. Then we'll know who's to blame for this trouble that we're in.' So they cast lots, and the lot singled out Jonah. Then they said to him, 'Tell us, who's to blame for this trouble that we're in? What is your business, and where are you from? What is your country, and what people are you from?' He answered them, 'I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of the heavens, who made the sea and the dry land.' And then men were seized by a great fear and said to him, 'What have you done?' The men knew that he was fleeing from the Lord's presence because he had told them. So they said to him, 'What should we do to you so the sea will calm down for us?' For the sea was getting worse and worse. He answered them, 'Pick me up, throw me into the sea, so that it will calm down for you, for I know that I am to blame for this great storm that is against you.' Nevertheless, the men rowed hard to get back to the dry land, but they couldn't because the sea was raging against them more and more. So they called out to the Lord, 'Please, Lord, don't let us perish because of this man's life, and don't charge us with innocent blood. For you, Lord, have done just as you pleased.' And then they picked up Jonah, threw him into the sea, and the sea stopped its raging. The men were seized by a great fear of the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows." Now, we kicked this series off last week in the book of Jonah. We've been looking at how Jonah heard God's voice and said, "I don't want to listen to you." God called Jonah to go preach to Nineveh, which is Jonah's enemies. They're an evil, bloody people to the north of Israel who constantly harassed and persecuted God's people, Israel. And Jonah said, "I'd rather them actually get God's vengeance than his mercy." And so he chose to say, I'm not going to go to Nineveh. In fact, I'm going to go as far away as I possibly can. And if you remember last week, I had a little graphic. I'm going to put it up on the screen behind me. I don't know if you were here last week. I was looking everywhere for this thing. I was like, I see it sort of on the monitor, but I don't see it anywhere. I looked up there, and then everybody was like, it's behind you, right? So this is our map. Jonah's here in Joppa, which is modern-day Tel Aviv. A lot of us don't know this. I didn't know this, so I went to Tel Aviv. But Tel Aviv is Joppa. Still there. And he should have gone to Nineveh up here. But instead, he takes a boat headed towards Tarshish, which is as far away as he possibly could go. And on his way, God ambushes him with a storm. And as he's interacting with the storm, and God's voice begins to speak, not just to Jonah, but all of the pagan sailors that are on this boat, we find a pattern for us to walk in, to be people who hear God's voice and respond. And it's simply this: look, ask, and do. So we're going to get a little bit uncomfortable today. I'm going to ask you to speak these back to me. Okay, it's interactive. You're like, oh no, we're going to have to interact today, all right? But we're going to do it anyway. So we're going to say these words together. Look. Okay. Who hasn't had coffee yet? All right. 1, 2, 3. Look. Ask and do. We're going to do it again. All right. Just because we want to get this like deep in our heads, okay? Look. Ask. Do. There's one person who's a little bit late. That's okay. Safe space. All right. All right. So look, ask, and do. We find these men looking, asking, and then finally doing what God wanted them to do. And I don't know about you, but I'm terrible at looking. I'm terrible at it. The other day, in fact, Friday, all of our kids were in school. So Tabitha and I were like, we're going to take a little bit of time for ourselves. We decided we'd have a date, and we decided we would walk from where we're staying all the way to Fretwell Coffee Shop, okay? And we decided to do that just because we like to get outside, and we've been enjoying walking the rail trail. So we were like, hey, let's go on the rail trail. Let's go get some iced coffee. It's going to be a great day. And Tabitha said, have you looked at the sky? It looks like it might rain. And I said, well, I looked at my app, and it says it's not. Tabitha said, funny story, I looked at my app too, and it says it's got 30% chance of rain in the next hour. And I said, technology lies to you. So we got our dog, we walked down the rail trail, down to Fretwell, got ourselves some tasty iced coffee, which is what I love more than almost any other beverage. And we got it, about to leave. Tabitha said, look, it looks like it's going to rain. I said, surely not. My app still says 0% of chance of rain until 3 o'clock. We were about halfway on our way home, and the skies opened like I've never seen before. It was just like, we were caught on the rail trail. There was nowhere to hide. We had to walk the rest of the way home completely soaked. So if you saw us, that was us. I didn't look. And I learned my lesson. Always listen to Tabitha, right? That's what I need to learn. Now, the sailors begin to look. In the scriptures, let's read verse 4 again. It says, but the Lord threw a great wind onto the sea, and such a great storm arose on the sea that the ship threatened to break apart. And because of this storm, the sailors begin to look. They begin to say, what's going on here? This isn't just any kind of storm, because it seems that God's behind this. Now, the Hebrew here is helpful because it gives us an insight into the way that God sees the world and the way that he wants us to see it. The Hebrew word for throw, which is what it says, God threw the storm, almost like he cast it out, is the word tul, which means to throw, to cast. In other ancient writings, this word is used to throw a spear. So it's almost as if God was like, I'm just going to throw the storm down in your path. Now, we're not in ancient Israel. We're here in the South. So probably the best approximation of this in our modern vernacular is the word chunk, right? We're good Southern people. It's as if God chunked the storm in front of Jonah to keep him from going away from the will and plan that God had for him. And as they're going through this storm, this crisis, the sailors begin to look and they say, this is not a normal storm. And it's instructive for us because a lot of us as Americans, we don't look at what God is doing. We simply treat the world as if it's simply a natural, non-supernatural space. Many of us have been infected by naturalism, where we simply think of the world as a place that God may have created, but then he left it alone. But the Bible tells us that God interacts within our stories and within our worlds, and he has an active part in calling us to himself. And so if we are people who are Christians, when we walk through the world, we can't simply say this is simply a world that's only based off of people's choices and actions and chance and happenstance and luck or karma or whatever you want to call it. We have to take into account that there is a living and active God who wants to use us and wants to know us and wants to meet us in our everyday, ordinary lives. And so when something comes in our path that can't simply be explained because of science or reason or a simple cause, Christians need to say, maybe God is up to something. For example, my family, we went up to a place called Jeter Farms yesterday, and we went up to go apple picking, which is a very manly pursuit. And as I'm standing in line trying to order some delicious barbecue, one of the only people in town that I know walks up to me at Jeter Farms. He's the only person I know at Jeter Farms at that moment, but he's somebody I went to lunch with. And I was like, okay, this is weird. Maybe this is God. Out of all the people I could have run into, you brought this dude into my life. What are you up to? That's how Christians see the world. But there is a danger for many of us. You know what the danger is? In fact, there are two dangers for us as Christians as we walk through the world. The first is seeing God in nothing, right? We're just kind of living our life. The other danger is seeing God in everything, where we are paralyzed by our own environments and everything happens to us. But instead, as Christians, we ought to be people who look and interact with the world and say, what are you doing in every one of these moments? And then we take it and we compare it to what the scriptures say. So if you're trying to hear God's voice, look and then come and compare and say, does this hold up to God's character? It's obviously not God if it's something that's sinful or it's harmful or it's something that's not true to the things that he reveals about himself already in the scriptures. So you have to compare it to what God of the universe has already revealed about himself in his word. But then I believe we ought to come and then talk to our friends and confirm it. That's what you see happening here. The sailors go, okay, there's something that's up. Let's talk to everybody in this boat and say, what's happening? Has anybody made a God angry at us recently? Let's talk through this together. And you find Jonah sharing that he's the one. You know, community is very powerful. A lot of us as Americans live as Lone Ranger Christians. We kind of try to just have our relationship with God alone. But God has revealed through Jesus that God himself is in community. Father, Son, and Spirit. Furthermore, Jesus, when he started this whole thing we call Christianity, what did he do? He started it by gathering disciples and living in community with them. And then he launched the church to be a community on mission together. And if you're looking for a home church, a place that you can call home, listen, you found the right place. You're among friends. And one of the best things you can do today is to join this church, to join a life group, to get plugged in. Because I know what it's like, man. Listen, as Christians, when we show up at a church for the first time, we can be like ninjas. We can slip in, slip out. Nobody even knows we're there. But there's so much more for you than that. God wants you to be a part of a community. And when you look at what God is doing, you have an invitation to then ask a question. So the first word was what? The second word is ask. They begin to ask a question. Look with me at verse 7. They say, let's cast lots, the sailors said to each other. Then we'll know who is to blame for this trouble we're in. So they cast lots, and the lot singled out Jonah. Now, many of us don't know what casting lots is. This is kind of an arcane practice that they did in the Old Testament. But casting lots was a way that people would ask God for his voice. And you find this throughout the Old Testament in different stories. Some stories you may not be as familiar with, but there was a man in the book of Exodus who stole some stuff that God said you needed to destroy. His name was Achan. And if you grew up in church, you may have heard this story and heard this little rhyme, which was that Achan stole the bacon. Has anybody heard that? No? Maybe just me? Okay. All right. So we're the only ones that are weird around here. All right. So Achan stole the bacon. I have no idea why. In fact, some of you guys are like, that's the only thing I'm going to learn from today, okay? But Achan stole God's stuff, and as a result, God's hand was no longer with the people of Israel. So they said, we're going to find out who that was and then bring him before God for justice. And so they cast lots, which was that they began to create a system of chance. They handed out different pieces of straw, and often they would find whoever had the short straw, they would choose that person. In Jonah's case, they probably took a bunch of rocks that were black rocks, put them in a bag, put one white rock in it, and whoever drew out the white rock, it was their fault. It was a way for them to ask God who it was. And wouldn't you know that Jonah's the one that pulls out the white rock. And he has a Taylor Swift moment. He's like, yeah, hi, it's me. I'm the problem. It's me. He's like, it was me. I was running from God. And look with me what he says in verse 9. He answered them, I'm a Hebrew. I worship the Lord, the God of the heavens, who made the sea and the dry land. So as they ask the Lord who it was, a lot of things are revealed. First of all, Jonah stands up and says, yeah, it's me. But then he begins to do something that's fascinating. He then begins to claim his identity. Up to this point, Jonah has been making only bad decisions. He's been running from God. He has been labeling himself a traitor to God's calling on his life. He's a runner. He has no future or hope. But in this moment, when people begin to ask God, he begins to then claim his identity as a child of God, one of God's people. What does he say? He says, I am a Hebrew. Now, this is not simply saying that he's a certain ethnic race or that he's got a passport from Israel. What he's doing here is he's claiming what God has spoken over him, which is that he has been set apart to worship God, and he's not been doing it. And then he goes on to say this, because I serve the Lord and because I've sinned against him, what I want you to do is I want you to cast me overboard. And everybody in that boat was faced with a decision. What were they going to do when God responded? What were they going to do? Look with me in verse 12. He says, pick me up and throw me into the sea so that it will calm down for you, for I know that I am to blame for this great storm that is against you. Every single one of us has a choice when God speaks. Many of us want God to speak. We've said, God, show me what you want me to do. God, show me. But if we're really honest, you may not want to hear what God has to say because then you may have to do it. Many of us want God to speak so that we can have an option on the menu. But if it's going to entail some kind of suffering, or if we're going to have to wait longer to get married, or it's going to, be a very difficult season, most of us are like, hey, listen, I'm going to opt out of that one. Can you just come back later with something else that you want me to do? But God does not give suggestions. He gives commands. And so we have to decide whether or not we're going to do what he wants us to do. And Jonah is tired of running. And what he knows is that he has to get off that boat. What did God tell Jonah to do? Go to Nineveh. And for him to do what God called him to do, he needed to take the first step, which was simply the next step, which is getting off the boat. And I've got to tell you, it probably didn't make any sense to Jonah. Some of us think that Jonah is jumping overboard in an act of suicide. He's like, ha, God, sucker. Like, I'm definitely not going to Nineveh. But I don't read the text that way. What you find is Jonah deciding to finally obey God and trust him fully. I'm going overboard. Why? Because the people on this boat don't deserve to die for my sinful choices. You don't have to die for me. I will die for you. And I'm going to trust God with what he'll do with that choice. Because I'm going to do the last thing that he told me to do, which is to go to Nineveh, and I cannot do it on this boat. And for the first moment in our story, Jonah begins to trust God with whatever he has left and goes overboard. You know, some of us, God is calling us to do something, y'all, and we're so scared of what it might mean. But God is not asking us to vet out what he's calling us to do. He's simply asking us to do it. He's not saying do it later or after the storm. He's saying right now, with what you've got, I want you to trust me. Whatever it is. You've been looking. You've asked me. I've told you. Now your responsibility is this. Do it. Y'all, following God can be some of the most intimidating and frightening things that we can do. But when we step out of the boat, God has the power and the means to do things that we could never imagine. Jonah had no idea that there was this fish that was tracking them down the whole time. You have no idea what God is putting around you if you'll simply trust him. God is asking you to do. Because when you obey, when you say, God, I will do it, you know what happens? Worship. Look with me what happens next in verse 15. They throw Jonah, verse 15, it says, then they picked up Jonah and they threw him into the sea. And the sea stopped its raging. And the men were seized by a great fear of the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So they throw him overboard. The sea stops. And these men who are pagans, who were not part of God's people, begin to worship the living God. They become more afraid of God than they are of the sea. Because they've had an encounter with the living God because of Jonah's act of faith. You know, there are people that you're spending time with at work or at the gym or at school who desperately need to experience God, and the only way that they're going to experience him is through your obedience, your life, the way that you trust God, the way that you live differently. And God wants to use you in it. But many of us aren't willing to see or ask the Lord for what he wants us to do. Now you may be asking, why would I do something that's scary? Why would I step into something different? That just doesn't seem like something I want to do. Why would I do that? Why? And the reason why is because of the person who's calling us to do it. You see, the whole entire book of Jonah is ultimately a story about Jesus. Except Jesus wasn't running from God. He was running to accomplish God's plan. And he wasn't ambushed by a storm. He ran to it. And the innocent one gave his life for us so that we wouldn't perish. Jonah was an unwilling sacrifice until God made him take the step of obedience. But Jesus willingly left heaven to come be among us and gave himself for us so that we could claim our true identity as his children, people who worship the God who created the sky, the dry land, and the sea. And when we choose to walk in that identity He's called us to live in, God can and will do incredible things. So I don't know where you are today. You may be running from God, and the storm clouds are gathering. God wants you to trust Him with your life. You may be doing really well with the Lord, but you know there's an aspect of your life that you have just been holding back. And maybe it's not because you're being disobedient, simply because you're scared. If Jesus is good, and God is a good Father, He's worth trusting. Because He has something for you that you can never dream up on your own. And He has something that's for you. So we're going to close out with our time of 120 seconds. It's simply our time to respond to the message. It's time for us to just hear what God has to say. And I want to invite you to do this. I want you to look, ask, and do. So I want you to look at your life. What is God doing? What is He doing in me? What is He doing in my life? What is He calling me to? Then I want you to ask Him. Ask Him how He wants you to respond. The scary thing is that God actually will respond. So ask Him, God, do you want me to give this relationship to you? God, do you want me to trust you with my future, my career, my college experience? God, do you want me to trust you with my children's story? Do you want me to let go of and trust you? God, do you want me to follow you to a new career path or into vocational ministry or go to the mission field? There's a bunch of us in this room who probably need to say, God, I'm actually going to be all in. I remember a friend of mine telling me, it's like, Mike, I love God, but I've only given Him 99% of my heart. And I know that 1% is everything. I'm scared to do it. Maybe that's you. But whatever it is that God is speaking to your heart, I want you to wrestle with this question. What is God asking you to do? Not what He's asking your wife or your husband or that one person that you're glad that came to church. What He's asking you to do. So for the next 2 minutes, be still enough to hear God's voice. This is probably the only time that you're not looking at your phone this week, okay? God's ordained this moment for you to be still and hear His voice. Jesus, would you call us home? Jesus, speak. We're listening. Whatever it is you want us to do, we're going to do it. Whether that means giving you our life, choosing to get baptized, joining the church, something even more mysterious than that. What are you asking me to do, God? Speak, I'm listening.